Good day all. Finally, this one has been a while coming, been threatening to happen for about 2 years, and it finally has, and well, it was definitely worth it. Dr. Christopher Beckwith was on the line with me to discuss his excellent book, Greek Buddha, Pyrrho's encounter with early Buddhism in Central Asia, and much more, tying in some of this with his new book coming soon on the Scythian philosophy. Dr. Beckwith is an award-winning American philologist at the University of Indiana in the Eurasian Studies Department and has written several excellent books on Central Asia. Links to those books are in the description. If you're already aware of Dr. Beckwith's ideas, you can skip ahead to the start of the interview. Otherwise, for the uninitiated, some basic premises I'm going to give to you now, just to give you also an idea of just how radical some of the material presented by Dr. Beckwith is, and particularly in this podcast where we go beyond the book. That's the theme of this podcast. So just quickly, Pyrrho was an influential Greek philosopher and the father of Pyrrhonism, and I suppose loosely the skeptical tradition, although he wasn't really a skeptic himself. He was a poet in Alexander the Great's retinue, and probably came across the early Buddhists very close to the historical Buddha's death. And while there, he took some element of the early Buddhist tradition back to Greece with him. And this in turn has shaped all sorts of the intellectual traditions in the West, even all the way down to David Hume, who we discuss, who wrangled with, some of the same problems. The really nuclear claim for Buddhists listening to this is that the Buddha himself was not reacting against Brahmanism as presented in the Buddhist texts and histories, but Scythian Zoroastrianism. And that not only that, but Brahmanism in fact came after Buddhism, which if true is pretty damn mind-blowing. And of course, that's not all. That's just the tip of the iceberg. And even if you ever look at the show notes now, you'll notice that there are some full-blown mind-bogglers in there, and that without a doubt, you're going to take away a whole lot from this podcast. And I anxiously await his new book that's coming out soon. Obviously, given the subject matter, Dr. Beckwith is very detailed, very well thought out, and we went for a touch under 2 hours. So timestamps are provided if certain parts are of more interest to you. Okay, here we go. Okay, well, this has been some time coming, Chris. I know we've been in correspondence for maybe, a year or two or something like that. And I think that the first time I contacted you was, of course, when the apocalypse was first descending upon us. And I understand since then you've had some projects that sound very interesting that have been demanding of your time. And so I'm just really glad to have you on finally. You're quite popular in our circles because of your revolutionary outlooks, and I think you'd be surprised. There's a lot of people that are really into it. So I think this interview is probably going to be a pretty big one, actually. So I think to start with, we'll just do the token academic background thing, keeping in mind that I've given a bit of an introduction prior to the interview, and I guess more specifically, how you came to be interested in Central Asia in general, as I believe you've I know you've written several books concerning ancient cultures in that area.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I've never been asked exactly that question, but I think part of it has to come from my origins. So I was actually born and raised for the first 11 years of my life up in a place called the UP, the Upper Peninsula of what is now the state of Michigan. And it's actually geologically a part of Canada. And it wasn't really connected to anything except by some distance. And so we lived in a remote, very small town. And we didn't actually live in the town. We lived outside the small town. It was an hour and a half, a mile and a half walk to town. I walked to school when I was a kid. And outside of our house, just behind our house, was the Great North Woods, as in Siberia, trees all the way to the Arctic Circle. So I played a lot in the forest, and my brother and I. and I used to go wandering in there, and it was sort of a place of you could get away from people if you wanted to. So it was sort of like here you are, you're doing whatever you need to do, and so on. Everything's going fine, but then something happens, and that's a way to get away. And so I found that out when I was a little kid, a very small kid. And so when you read about Central Eurasia, I mean general Central Eurasia, so the whole thing, the central part of Eurasia meaning Europe and Asia all together, one continent, of which Central Asia is a part. It's the kind of the urbanized, more civilized part, you might say, traditionally. But Central Eurasia as a whole, the most important part actually wasn't there. It was the steppe zone, which is grassland, not trees, not forest, but that's where people could go. And if you were there, you could escape from that one part of it to another part by moving, as I found out when I read about them. And I was in college already, and I read a book about a traveler, an explorer, a fictionalized account of an actual Russian explorer who went to Central Asia and Mongolia and Tibet.
Okay, and who was that? Was that out of interest?
I think it may be Kozlov, but anyway, it was the book was called Kukushkin, a really good read. It was a fictionalized account and translated into English. And it was, my mom had gotten it from the library. I was back in at home, and at that time we moved south to Ohio. And I went there after I'd been in Taiwan for a while, and she had this book sitting on her coffee table, and so I looked at it, and I thought, this is really good. And I asked her about it. She said, "Oh yeah, that's a great book. I found it in the library." So this is my mom. So it's kind of a family and upbringing kind of thing. Ultimately, in there, I'd gotten interested in Tibetan in high school, actually, before that, on my own, by working in the public library and looking at all the books as I worked there, and noticed these books about Tibet and Buddhism, and read all of them, and tried learning some Tibetan from one of them, which is almost impossible. But anyway, I did learn a little bit from it.
I hear it's quite a difficult language, quite a hard, alien kind of language. There's not a lot like it. Is that the case?
It's very different from English, but as a spoken language, it's not particularly difficult to learn if you just learn the spoken language. And as the Old Tibetan is not really so difficult as it might be, but the classical language, Buddhist language, and classical texts, especially translations from Sanskrit, they're very difficult unless you have a special training in reading that stuff. And I was never interested in it, so I didn't get that training. But anyway, that's kind of where I got into it. And I was in Chinese major as an undergraduate, so I went to Taiwan and was studying there and Chinese literature in National Taiwan University. And it just didn't, I guess I lost interest in it or something while I was there. I liked Taiwan very much. And so I learned to speak Chinese better and to read and write Chinese better. And that was what I got out of that. But I decided after reading that book that I mentioned that I think, okay, I'll apply not only to East Asian programs for a PhD. I decided to switch from Taiwan back to the United States. And then I would apply also to Indiana University, where I happened to know somebody who was a student here and also a teacher who was in our department, the department at that time. It had a different name. It was called the Department of Uralic and Altaic Studies. And so I was accepted at these other schools, and even though they said, well, nobody offered me, a fellowship or anything. So they said, well, we'll help you borrow anything you need. Sure. But this one was less expensive, and it wasn't the cost at all that appealed to me. It was the idea of studying all these strange languages, not only Tibetan and Mongolian and Uzbek and all sorts of other languages besides the standard ones, Chinese, Japanese, Arabic, and so on. So I came here, and it caught me, it hooked me, and I've been here ever since. And they changed the name when I was chairman. I had the name changed to Department of Central Eurasian Studies. So that's my background.
Is it common to have a department like that? It sounds quite fortuitous to
the only
come.
One.
The only one, really? Okay.
The only one, so far as I know, in the world, there are programs in some of the languages, in some departments of this or that, so you might be able to do, I don't know, Mongolian or something in an East Asian studies department, or Tibetan in a South Asian studies department. But there are some programs in Inter-Asian studies. There's one at Harvard, and some other universities have similar things, programs. But this is the only department that I know of, an actual independent academic unit, and it has its good things and bad things about it. But on the whole, it's been fairly good for the students who've come here and been sort of stuck it out.
It certainly sounds like it gave you a good launching pad to do what you do. So keeping in mind that this podcast is essentially about Pyrrho and the Greek Buddha, which is a book that you wrote some time ago, and I just want to keep that in mind, because there's probably going to be a lot of details that you've forgotten or can't recall, because it's a very detailed book, obviously. And
yes, it is.
I would suggest to people, if they want a really deep dive into this, that they go and purchase it immediately. It's an excellent book. So keeping this in mind, and I think particularly, unlike my audience, I'm in possession of probably what I describe as a fairly pedestrian IQ, probably compared to yourself. But we'll try to keep it general and easy for people to comprehend and understand. And I'd like to basically just paint a picture of what we're getting at here and why this is important. Many in the audience probably have some idea, and I know some listeners absolutely have a good understanding of this, but I think it will come from you best to discuss this. But could we just get a brief rundown of Greek Buddha, and perhaps what your intellectual starting point was that led you to write such a book concerned with the historical Buddha and his outlooks?
Very good question. I've been trying to remember. I actually wrote the book, the draft manuscript, 10 years ago, and it took me another, couple of years to polish it up and finish it and send it off to the press. And then they always took, back then, about 3 years to produce the book. So that's why it's 2015. It's not only that I haven't really read it for a while. It's a long, even more that I've written it, and there's some things that I've discovered since then that I realize I must doing a revised edition of that book, because I think that's one of my best books, and I learned things while working on my most recent book, which is about the Scythians, and their philosophy, also one of the big parts of that book. So I know you want to know about that. But about Pyrrho, I have to say I was interested in this already in college. Going back, I took a class in, I was a Chinese major, as I mentioned. And so I don't know why, but I had a friend who was interested in philosophy, a philosopher, a couple of friends interested in philosophy. So I decided I better learn something about philosophy, and I signed up for a course, which I didn't have to take, but it turned out it had over 300 students in it, because it fulfilled some sort of requirement. So I sat way in the back, way up, at 20th row or something, in this enormous lecture hall. And this apparently well-known professor taught, and most of it I didn't find very interesting, but he did talk about what he called classical skepticism in one lecture. And I thought, that sounds great. That sounds like me, So I went out to the library and found the Loeb Classical Library translation and text of Sextus Empiricus, which is what he's citing all the time as being the main source. Of course, that's late Pyrrhonism, as I now know, but at the time I didn't know any better. And I thought, oh, this is really great stuff, So I read this book and filed that away. And the next semester, quarter or so, 1 or 2 quarters later, I had to write a paper for a Chinese philosophy class, which I was taking as a Chinese major. And so I wrote this paper comparing Greek Pyrrhonism and Chinese Daoism. And I had no idea then. I got a good grade on the paper, and teacher liked it and everything like that. But I had no idea that it was, it was on the right track. So I discovered this while working partly on this book, and there are some parts of it that mention Lao Tzu, Daoism, and partly in my new book, which is called the Scythian Empire, there's a whole chapter called Scythian philosophy, which deals with that. But anyway, so how I got into the study of what Pyrrho was doing, I don't know, but at some point, it was probably always in the back of my mind. And because I was dealing with Central Asia a lot, I dealt a lot with Central Asia, both in antiquity and in the early Middle Ages, starting with the early Middle Ages, actually, that I had my mind on that area. And that must be where the Buddha or his ancestors came from. We know about that from various things that I mentioned them, I discussed them in the book. And the Scythians call themselves Sakas. At some point, the name Skutha changed according to regular rules and according to in different dialects. But in the main dialect of Scythian, ancient Scythian, the name became Saka instead of Skutha. It became Sukta or something Sakta, something like Sakta, and then the D disappeared, so it's just Saka, and it actually follows completely regular rules within Scythian. It's hard to recognize, and most scholars haven't recognized it. So the Scythians were calling themselves Scythians, still Scythians, but they said Saka, and not all of them did, but most of them. So Sakyamuni, you may have seen it. It's Shakyamuni, actually. That's the Sanskrit epithet for the Buddha. And people have always wondered about that. It means the sage of the Shakas, or the Sakas, the Scythians. And it's been traditionally interpreted by Buddhologists and Indologists as, and especially in India and Nepal, as being the sage of the Shakyas, who are supposedly a clan of people living in Nepal, because there was this story that the Buddha was from Nepal, and so on and so on. Well, it turns out not to be correct. So whether or not the Shakyas are Shakas, actually Sakas, it's quite possible that they might actually have some connection with the ancient Sakas. So it's possible that the Buddha's, people, they moved there, or he moved there in that general area. It's quite possible. We don't have any evidence for it. So, but I wanted to find out, I don't remember how exactly, but I got interested in this topic again. And so that's why I was looking into it more and more. And I just found out I read some of the scholarship on it. Actually, one of the things that got me seriously into working on a book on it was Richard Bett's book, Pyrrho, which is an excellent book from the point of view of Greek philosophy. It does have the pretty much standard view, which is that he was a Greek doing things for Greek reasons, because there are other Greeks, because he was a Greek, lived in Greece and Europe. He went to India for a while. He was in Alexander the Great's entourage, and we know that's accepted, and it's very clear that he did that. And he came back, and blah blah blah. But he was still a Greek, and it's all for Greek reasons. Now, Richard Bett is not an extremist in that. He does give credit to certain things which are outstandingly, remarkably, unusually different from everybody else in Greek thought. And he points those out, two things, I think, and suggests one or two other things that may be something to do with his experience in India. And so I just thought, I got to track this down and read all this stuff. So I did that, and the more I got into it, the more I just, well, okay, I'm going to do this, So, and the thing is that one of the things that had been, I remember, sorry, there was one particular thing that got me onto this, that I hadn't really been dealing with it for decades, is that when I wrote the book before this, or two books before it, Empires of the Silk Road, there was, I covered lots and lots of topics fairly briefly, but it covers the Central Eurasia from the Bronze Age to the present. That's about 4,000 years of history. And so some things had to be covered, pretty sketchily, and I don't know, I'm not an expert in, of course, all that stuff. So I depended on secondary sources, but some of the things I was more interested in others. and look into more. And at some point in that doing that or after that, I continued my interest in the Buddhism in Central Asia and so on. So my next book after that was actually Warriors of the Cloisters, which is about I'd say it's history of science. I forgot the subtitle, but anyway, history of science in Central Asia, early history. The Buddhists are the ones who are responsible for the scientific method, what people used to call the scientific method anyway. And the college actually is not a European invention like almost all the Europeans, as a scholar can say. It was an importation, and it's actually historical to all in my book, that book, Warriors of the Cloisters. So that got me more and more interested in Central Asia as a Buddhist locus, and I think that's the reason why I've ended up, doing this book. But that's a guess. I can't say for sure. Does that help any?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, that's very detailed. That's excellent. So just to circle back, and I just want to make it clear for maybe some of the listeners who are not up to speed on some of these topics. So we're talking about Pyrrho of Elis, who was, I believe, was he the first Greek skeptic philosopher? I'm not 100% clear on that, but he's definitely one of the first, isn't he?
He's probably the first actual skeptic. There are several kinds of skeptics. There are what they call academic skeptics and Pyrrhonian skeptics. So Pyrrho, obviously the Pyrrhonian, he's the founder of that tradition. It wasn't a school, an organized school. He couldn't be, according to his own teaching. So it's a sort of an unschool, or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Of thought, and it continued. But
sure. And you're suggesting then that Pyrrho, who was, I believe, he was a poet as well, wasn't he? He was with Alexander's retinue through Central Asia, and then through that time he picked up the philosophy of the Buddha and probably other Central Asian philosophies as well, I would imagine. Or do you contend that it was just early Buddhism that he really interacted with?
It seems to be just early Buddhism, because people have said that before, because they had a very vague idea about India and what Indian thought was like at that time. As it happens, we have nothing before Pyrrho's visit there and Alexander's visit there. And so we have things in Greek from that visit. So the people who are with his court visited, they were in Taxila, which is near what is now Rawalpindi in Pakistan. That was one of the main cities there, ancient Taxila, Taxil. And so anyway, they stayed there for a while, and Pyrrho was with them, and the philosophers were hanging out mainly just outside the city. And so they met these people and saw them and what they were doing, and they described them. They were sort of astonished by some of it. And of course, this got everybody interested in it. So they wrote up their reports. And Pyrrho didn't write anything after his experience with the poem that he describes. He wrote a poem dedicated to Alexander, a panegyrical poem praising him, And Pyrrho, Alex liked it a lot. So he poured 10,000... He gave him 10,000 gold coins, a fortune, of course.
Not bad for a day's work. I'd take that. Yeah,
that's the kind of thing that Alexander liked to do, is to really give a huge reward to somebody, not just a little reward, but a huge one. So then it was shortly after that Pyrrho was with the teacher he'd picked up with, Anaxarchus, a Greek philosopher who was in the court. He was chastised by an Indian for pandering to the king or to kings or whatever like that, and not being a model for people to learn from. And so Pyrrho was sitting, his face goes red. You can imagine this. What you just do. And so from then he withdrew from society, and he obviously studied with somebody there. It was a Buddhist. Everything is Buddhist. It's early Buddhist.
And it'd be really good, sorry to interrupt, but just to go into that quickly. So obviously through this process, you've noticed similarities between Buddhism and Pyrrhonism, or skepticism, his form of skepticism. Can we talk about some of those similarities and what you
Yes.
noticed?
Yes. Yeah. Just let me just say what I was going to say is that we don't have any sources other than Pyrrho, second study of uh, um, Pyrrho's thought, which is recorded in an obscure way, but anyway, it's recorded. It goes directly back to something that he said, which is, and there's some other sources on that. But when it comes to India, what the culture was like there, what it could have been like, all the different schools there, all the traditions from Indian thought are all from the late antiquity or the Middle Ages. And they're mostly very fanciful and full of magic and all kinds of things, and have virtually nothing to do with reality. So they don't tell us what even early Buddhism was like, not to speak of early Hinduism or Brahmanism or any of those other belief systems, what they were did they even exist yet? We only get some information coming from the first inscriptions, first things written in India were the inscriptions of a king known as Priyadarshi, and who's been traditionally been called Ashoka. But there are two sets of inscriptions, and the other ones, which have the name Ashoka on them, actually, some of them, are much later, probably several centuries later, and have nothing to do with this earlier stuff, which says very little. It does say something, and this man, King Priyadarshi, was apparently an adherent of some kind of Buddhism. He calls it the Dhamma. But so that's all we have. So in order to get, and we have a report of a Greek envoy who was an ambassador, like to the then King of India, about 30 years afterwards, and 30 years after Pyrrho was there. Megasthenes is his name. He wrote a book when he came back. It's called Indica. It's been lost, but fragments of it have been preserved, including long sections on the thought of those people in India. So actually, we have hard data in that book. It's pretty limited, but some of it's quite specific. It tells us about what some of those people thought, including early Buddhists and early Brahmanists, and another school that you mentioned in one of your questions for me is the Gymnatai, the naked ones, usually called the Gymnosophistai, the gymnosophists. But that's actually a later popular term. The correct term was, in fact, the naked ones, and it was a specific sect. It wasn't just all those ancient philosophers who were wrapped together as the gymnosophistai is supposed to mean. So I just want to make that clear before we move on to that other question you had. What was your question now?
So certainly, no, that was wonderful. Thank you. It was just concerning. Obviously, through this process, you'd looked at Pyrrhonism and you looked at early Buddhism. What are some of the similarities and concepts that led you to put the picture together and to see the link there?
Yes. The thing is that the key, most important bit of data we have for Pyrrho's thought, which goes back, according to all the testimonies, directly to Pyrrho himself. Well, the central part of it is a short passage that is in a work. It was in a work written by his student Timon called the Python, and that's actually refers to the god, and then that was lost. But portions of that, a large part of that, was available still in antiquity. So various people copied bits from it, and this Aristotelian philosopher Aristocles lived around about 2,000 years ago. He wrote a book on philosophy, and because Pyrrhonism had kind of was back in fashion again after having seemingly more or less just almost disappeared for a while. So he had to write about it. So he wrote about Pyrrho and Pyrrhonism. There's a whole chapter on it, and that was his chapter was copied over by Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea in the Holy Land in his book on Introduction to the Bible, I think it is, or Introduction to Holy Studies or something. I've forgotten the title. But anyway, so that is preserved, fortunately for us. And what what Aristocles quotes, and he quotes this passage because that passage is so important. It's usually called the Aristocles passage, and people ignore everything else in the chapter, which is not good because other parts, other bits, are also going back apparently to the same fount of information. And so people have not paid much attention to that. So I pay attention to it. But the key passage is this Aristocles passage. It's been studied and read by many people and translated and people have tried to interpret it. And it's really difficult. Nobody can really figure it out. They have all sorts of problems with it. And the key part of it, the most important part of it, is that Pyrrho says about Timon, his student, is the one who frames this. He said he asked, he got this from Pyrrho. And so what are pragmata like? Pragmata is the equivalent of dharmas. Dharmas are the constituents, that make up everything in the conceptual universe.
Right.
And
so in English, pragmata means like ethical matters, basically. Is that correct?
Yes. Basically any kind of thing. So if you're talking about goodness and justice and all these sorts of things, those are ethical issues. So that people say, is this good or bad? Is it just or unjust? Those are the classic questions that they especially the Pyrrhonists, they use those a lot. And it turns out lots of other people did too. But anyway, those are among the examples that are there. So So what are these pragmata like, these dharmas? And Pyrrho says they are all adiaphora. They are all undifferentiated. They are this is what the words literally mean. They are unbalanced or somehow imperfect in some way, and they are not fixed or established. Okay.
Which could mean impermanent if you think about it.
Yes, it certainly can. It certainly can. And that struck me. That, whoa, what is this here? So I read more about this and studied the Greek and redid everything myself and wrote a long article which was published in 2010 or 2011 on this passage, on the Greek and on the text and everything. And anyway, so thinking about it, looking at it, it's just striking that these are the three things. And then he has another bit in there saying that, and so because of this, things are like that, therefore you can't tell the difference between truth and the false, the truth and a lie, or whatever, truth and falseness, and also, so what should you do? And it's at some point in here that it becomes Timon talking, but I think it's still Pyrrho until the second group of three things. Everything's negative. This is extremely important. Pyrrho doesn't say anything positive. It's all negative. Negative. Not this, not this, not that, not this. Don't do this. Don't do that. That kind of thing. He doesn't say what you should do. He says what you should not do.
So it's completely devoid of metaphysics, essentially. Is that how you describe it?
Absolutely, yes. No metaphysics involved at all. And people have tried to explain it as metaphysics. It just doesn't make any sense. Then the second part is that he says, so you shouldn't have any views. Have no views. It's extremely important. Have no views about things and opinions or whatever. And don't let yourself be unbalanced. So stay balanced somehow, don't be pulled this way and that. And then stick to it. Don't give up. So basically that's what he teaches. And of course, if you know anything about the best work in Buddhism, which I didn't know at the time, I knew a little bit about it, but I read a lot more. The best work on trying to establish what early Buddhism was from inside, using the sutras and other texts that we have from the tradition. And I think it was Luis Gomez who talks about the no views, and that is in some of the absolute earliest Pali suttas. And so does that mean it goes back to the time of the Buddha because it's in the Pali Suttas or in the later Mahayana Sutras or anything. No, it doesn't mean that for sure. But it corresponds exactly to what Pyrrho says, and nobody else in Greek thought ever said anything like that, never imagined saying anything like that. They say, oh no, you must have the right way. This is my way is the right way. My teachings. So Pyrrho didn't say that at all. Don't have any, none of that stuff. So this is his teachings just line up so directly and perfectly with those of the Buddha in the earliest core teachings, which are, it's called the three characteristics of all dharmas, the tri-lakshana. And those have this, the famous, all dharmas are impermanent, right? Impermanent. And they're dukkha, whatever dukkha means, it's disputed, still very much disputed, but it's clearly the negative of sukha. Sukha is good, but actually, what is ka? Ka is important. This is probably not a Sanskrit or Indic word at all, something else. Maybe it was Scythian, I don't know. And then the third thing was, what was the other thing? Was, the equivalent of adiapara. I mean, all things have no self-identity, no inherent self-identity. A soul, we call that a soul for people. Or people say, oh, well, trees have souls. And well, it actually is an inherent identity of some sort. And those are the things which distinguish one thing from another, one person from another. This inherent identity. That's what it's talking about. The same thing as Pyrrho has. And Pyrrho, it appears that it's switched the order of them. So he puts that first and he puts the impermanent last. But the three things, they're all negative. They have the same import. They have the same logic. And the logic is very important. Nobody, as far as I know, nobody ever really studied the logic of them. They're connected. It's not just, he pulled this one out of the blue here and he went over there. Oh, look at that tree, that Bodhi tree. I'll get this other one here. And then there's this other one. Oh, whatever. So it was very carefully, it's really very deep. And that Trilakshana is the core of Buddhist traditional meditation. That was the goal that, and then when the Buddha achieved Bodhi or Nirvana, it's called in the earliest texts, that's what he got. It was enlightenment. He reached this, I forgot the dhyana, the fourth dhyana or something, particular one, which focuses on the Trilakshana. That's how it worked, or that was his solution, is to figure out the Trilakshana, I suppose. But anyway, that was his breakthrough. And when Pyrrho was in India, clearly this was an early Buddhism period, not late Buddhism, not what we normally refer to as Buddhism. Is really almost nothing like it, except for some of the basic teachings and some of the particular features of Buddhism, which are from the beginning, probably from the Buddha himself.
It would be interesting to go through maybe some stories about how Pyrrho lived. I know you present a few in your book because I think it's like an interesting way of viewing, at least what he took from India at the time. Would you be able to relate a few of those stories?
Well, the stories, I don't know, but the stories are worth reading on their own. They're interesting stories. But the most important points are what seem to be the historical bits. One of the things that the Buddha did was to wander. Buddhists wandered, and they still do in many cultures. They wander. They travel around. They beg. Some of them live in the forest or wherever. They're a smaller group, the more serious ones, and they wandered around. Well, the Scythians wandered. That they're nomads. Nomads means wanderers. So it's the most normal thing in the world for somebody to do that. And I just wondered, one of the questions that I asked myself back then, what about these peripatetic philosophers of ancient Greece? And the Chinese seem to do the same thing. They walk around a lot while they're teaching. Well, why do they do that? Well, did they not have a place to live, or they just accustomed to walking around or riding around a lot to keep moving? I don't know, but it's one of the striking things about the early Buddhists and traditional Buddhism is that they wandered. So in this, they talk about Pyrrho wandering. He would go off with people and wander. It says so in the accounts. And everybody is so astonished by this, of course. That's one thing. Another one is that they have this comment about him, that he was, uniformly unmoved. He would apparently sit, just a second. Oh, another hour probably. Just go ahead and eat, Ina. Sorry. Where was I? Yeah. Anyway, he was able to endure surgery without any flinching or anything. Like he was not even conscious of it. How did he do that? This is one of the things that the ancient Indian philosophers that are described by the Greeks when they were there with Alexander and Megasthenes as well, that they would have this kind of yoga, what we would call yoga, which is they meditate, of course, but they do this while they're holding a position, sometimes holding a large, heavy object at the same time to make it more difficult, for hours at a time, unmoved. So, boing, this is another thing which struck me, okay. And what was the other thing? There was
It's interesting, just on that point, because I practice Buddhism and been on meditation retreats, and one of the teachers told me once, your exercise is if you can sit in that chair all day and not move, then you're getting somewhere, which I refuse to do. But I can see how that would be something that they would look at.
Yeah. And another thing was that he remained unmarried, and he remained unmarried. And what was the other thing? Yeah, being unmarried is no big deal, but it's something about he had a sister. He took care of his sister, but basically he lived almost like a hermit, and so a lot of things about Pyrrho, and he was considered to be like a holy man. In his hometown, gave him set up a statue to him in the marketplace. It's described by Pausanias, the famous Greek, geographer. He traveled around Greece and described the antiquities, including this Pyrrho's. And he said there's a tomb to Pyrrho nearby. So he was thought of very highly by his fellow townsmen. He didn't actually live in a town, probably. He lived outside somewhere.
I see. So you mentioned earlier, and we'll just continue down this line, and after this I want to circle back to the Brahmanism connection at some point. So we'll spend a little bit of time on this, but you mentioned you came across Sextus Empiricus first. That was the first exposure you had to skepticism. Now, for the audience, I don't think they fully understand necessarily the implications of this and the significance of this connection, because this has gone on then to influence a whole lineage of philosophers through history, and particularly in Europe, even going through David Hume, for example, who has obviously had an enormous impact on science and the way we view things in general, and perhaps even in many ways set the path for even something like postmodernism, maybe. I mean, so could we go through maybe the problem of criterion and what that is, and then how this has gone on then to influence European thought and philosophy a little bit through the ages?
Yes. Well, the problem of the criterion, I actually looked into what I wrote about this, and it's there's a second, I have it all nice and summary. So the ancient problem of the criterion, it's already in ancient Greece after Pyrrho. This became one of the major topics of philosophy. Actually, all of philosophy changed after Pyrrho and Timon. They essentially invalidated much of the other philosophy. At least they said that they did, and a lot of people had to agree with them. And that was because of the problem of the criterion. And this is the way it runs in the ancient version. In order to have absolutely correct, true knowledge about anything, you must have a criterion that distinguishes between true and false, right? Well, in order to know if the criterion is correct, it allows you to choose between true and false, we need to use another criterion to make sure you have the right criterion, a true or false criterion. So we need to have a criterion to pick that. But in order to pick that criterion, we have to have be able to choose the true and false one, to choose the chooser criterion, which will choose the other one, and so on ad infinitum. It's impossible to have a criterion of truth as the conclusion to this. Pyrrho doesn't put it that way. Pyrrho is, let me just have it here. It's in his the three characteristics of all pragmata and so on that I mentioned, all dharmas. That yes. So he says. Right. Because pragmata don't, the things, philosophical things, not real things, but different ethical objects, they don't actually have differentiate of their own, because nothing has its own differentia. That's what Pyrrho says, and following the Buddha. So they don't have them different differentiate by nature. For example, we see somebody that makes a face at you, and you don't have a little label next to that face, like in a cartoon. There'll be a drawing. You have a little balloon. It says anger pointing to him. That's an angry face. And you have somebody makes another face, and you have another little balloon there, or a little label says happiness or something. We don't have any labels. So none of these things are labeled. What we do is we supply those terms, those labels, for everything. And this is just silly examples, but the basic point is that there aren't any intrinsic differentiate in anything. We supply those. They're created by people. So that makes the entire process of doing this sort of a logical thing, trying to determine, truth and versus falseness and good and bad and so on. Again, all those things have no actual differentia, so that we supply them, so that the entire process of choosing them using whatever method you want is going to be strictly circular and logically invalid. That's the way it's traditionally analyzed. So this is Pyrrho's statement of it, actually, and he says because of the things don't have their own differentiate, then we cannot tell the difference between truth and falseness, a lie and an untruth, and so on. So he says that we can't tell the difference between them. So the takeaway from this is that this applies to everything, and if this applies to everything, and by the way, all the way through when it was revived, Pyrrhonism was revived when Sextus Empiricus was translated in the late Renaissance, and actually Hume didn't read Sextus Empiricus. He may not have known about it. He read an encyclopedia article, a French encyclopedia article about Pyrrho and Pyrrhonism, and it has some mistakes in it and some academic academic skepticism, which says that we can't know anything. So it's a dogmatic system. And the ancient skeptics, the Pyrrhonists, said, no, that's not skepticism. That's not us. That's false. That's a wrong idea, just like all the other wrong ideas.
It was a French encyclopedia by a guy called Bailey. Am I thinking of the right guy? Yeah, okay, yeah. And here, I'm led to believe he had actually in that same volume a number of, I guess, proto-descriptions of Buddhism in Japan as well. And I always wondered, maybe did David Hume read about that as well? I'm not sure how detailed those descriptions were, but I always wondered if there's a connection there.
Interesting thought. I don't know, and I don't know if I noticed any references to those things being in that encyclopedia, which I've never actually seen. So it would be a good thing to look into that, no doubt. But I don't think that Hume seems to have really known anything about Buddhism at all. So And what he did know about Pyrrhonism, I think he himself corrected it somehow in his mind. He got some of the wrong ideas, but he basically fixed it, even without knowing that, that what he got from this encyclopedia article wasn't exactly, it didn't represent Pyrrho's thought very well, or even Sextus's necessarily. Yeah, but I don't think he got anything about Buddhism directly. But he did get this point about the criterion and the so-called problem of induction, which is the biggest problem in Western philosophy for the last couple of years, ever since he formulated. He didn't formulate a problem of induction. He never speaks about that induction. In fact, he uses induction a couple of times, but in a different meaning. But he does set up the problem, which is essentially the same issue, the problem of the criterion, and he puts it out in a very interesting way. And so it's worth reading. I recommend to everybody to read his little book. It's a very little book, not the huge thing that modern philosophers are crazy about, the treat, but the inquiry into human understanding. It's beautifully written. His English is beautiful. It's very clear, and you really get a feeling for what David Hume was all about by reading that.
Some of the so when doing a little bit of research on this myself, some of the modern philosophy and the takes on these problems, I could not even comprehend what they were talking about. It was absolutely ridiculous. Some of them,
They're really you might call them academic philosophers, in the sense that they're doing it as a part of their academic work. So it does not necessarily have anything to do with you might call real philosophy, the philosophy that's for the sake of philosophy, for
living.
living, yes, for living, thinking, and so on an everyday, regular basis, which is what philosophers were interested
Sure.
in.
And particularly, it's what I like about the Greek philosophers was the fact that they lived what they thought. It wasn't just like, this is a theoretical construct that I think is important. They actually stood by what they thought.
Yeah, that's one of the main things that they're required to do to be but it was, remember that philosophy, we translate as philosopher, it's a Greek word, and we've made it into our word philosopher. Well, our word philosopher is basically a university professor of philosophy these days, and very few other people would qualify. Whereas in the ancient world, the word philosophos actually included what we would call philosophers, or philosophy, and science, whatever we call science, it was included, technology, including engineering, and lots of other stuff, and religion, very definitely. So it didn't separate them. One word stood for lots of things, had a much broader meaning, whereas our words in English tend to be much more, not always, but tend to be much more narrow and precise in some way. That's a curse, blessing and a curse. So yeah, we should avoid being misled by that. I warn everybody about it many times in my book. It probably is a bore.
It sounds to me like then there's almost like two streams of thought in Western philosophy then. So you have the skepticism, and then and from what you're describing, it sounds like Pyrrho was maybe the opposite of, I guess, that Aristotelian stream of thought, the laws of thought that he has about, I forget what they are exactly off the top of my head, but it sounds almost like the opposite to that. And it's interesting the way you're describing it, that it's almost like you have these two schools of thought that are in conflict. And, perhaps the church was the one that continued that Aristotelian angle of things. And then on the other hand, you've had this kind of skepticism that's survived through the ages and popped up at different times. Would that be an fairly overall accurate?
Close. Pyrrho and Timon essentially consider, Pyrrhonism to be, at least certainly Timon was mainly our own, almost our only, actual testimony to Pyrrho himself, from what fragments of his works are preserved. But he and Pyrrho apparently too considered Pyrrhonism to be one thing, in all the rest of all other philosophy, which means philosophy and religion, whatever, to be another thing. So it's X and Y, So that they didn't distinguish. In other words, academic skepticism we use the same word for Pyrrhonistic skepticism, supposedly, and academic. Pyrrhonist skepticism isn't skepticism in the way that we use the term skeptical at all. It doesn't have, it's not really a good term for it. So Pyrrhonism is a much better term. But anyway, those classical academic skeptics who said that, the extreme ones, that, we don't know anything, and all these dogmatic statements, which are negative dogmatic statements, but they are not, there's no validity to them. The thing that characterizes Pyrrhonism, in my mind, Pyrrho's thought anyway, and I think the early Pyrrhonists, as far as we know them, besides Pyrrho, was its focus on logic, and so logic and again ethics. Whereas when you get later on, it becomes more and more a little bit more developed in different aspects in late skepticism, late Pyrrhonism. But they always had to fend off the academic skeptics. So academic skeptics would include Plato to some extent, for example, Socrates, and their continuators and successors. Whereas Aristotle was a completely different school of philosophy. I think Aristotle was a genius, a great thinker and everything, but in some respects misguided. but anyway, everybody makes mistakes. So, but I was always impressed by Aristotle.
Yeah, it's hard not to be, and it's difficult to not criticize these people, but maybe to reevaluate some of the assumptions that, particularly Aristotle, because he has such an enormous impact on the way that we think and the way that we perceive the world, and it's not necessarily, scientific, I would say. And perhaps many of the conflicts we have today are as a result of some of those laws of deduction. But anyway, it's a different discussion. So just circling back now to another one of the, I suppose, controversial or heretical theories in your book, at least to some people. So I wanted to get into this idea of Brahmanism and this differentiation you make that the texts are wrong. So the Buddha was not arguing or rebelling against Brahmanism as it is generally accepted, and that in fact he was rebelling against Zoroastrianism. And for those not in the know, this may seem like a small point, but to Buddhists, that is a radical shift of their entire historical worldview, I'd say. So can we get into this a little bit, and how you came to revise that understanding?
Well, first I have to emphasize that we actually don't know anything about Brahmanism at all until the Greeks got to India, because there are no sources in any Indian language, nothing, no accounts, no nothing. The only thing that we have in an Indian language before CE times is a few bits from the inscriptions of King Priyadarshi that I mentioned from the middle of the 3rd century, and that's BC. And he limits, he makes some specific injunctions forbidding animal sacrifice, and he uses the Brahmanist technical terms that are used in the Vedas. So this was pointed out by Pat Olivelle. I would never know this, but anyway, that's in the inscriptions. So that clearly it existed then, and so that it existed so that he could say no to the Brahmanists. No, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. There are several other things that he forbids, which are specifically non-Buddhist or something. They're Brahmanist, and he did say that he went to Sambodhi, which is Bodh Gaya. And after that, he started teaching the Dharma and preaching the Dharma. Well, instead of campaigns of conquest, you will have campaigns of I don't know, conversion or something, teaching people about Buddhism. But it doesn't say Buddhism anywhere. The term Buddhism didn't exist yet. But Dharma is the term. And so far as Brahmanism, we don't know anything about it. But Zoroastrianism, we do know that Zoroastrianism was there in the area of what is now northern Pakistan, I guess. And much farther than that, or northwestern, then it was northwestern Indian subcontinent. But how far beyond that, we don't know. But that was part of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the official religion was Zoroastrianism, and that meant belief in one God, Ahura Mazda, the God of heaven, who created heaven and earth. It promises, the good people go to paradise and the bad people go down there into the bad place, and heaven and hell, this sort of thing. So this is first taught, so far as anybody knows, by Zoroaster. We don't know the date of the Old Avesta in which these statements are outlined, but we do have the dates for Darius the Great, the first actual Persian ruler of this great empire, and we usually call the Persian Empire. It's not exactly accurate, but anyway, so he was a Persian, and he was a Persian emperor, so Persian Empire under him for sure, and he teaches these things in his inscriptions, and he proclaims them. These other people are doing these bad stuff. Worshiping the Daivas. The Daivas were not. They were deities, like with a capital D, that were wanting to be at the same level as God. There can only be one God. There can only be one emperor who is chosen by God and put in the throne by God. There's one empire, and so on. One. It's a monistic system. And it's extremely interesting. And in my book, we'll talk about this in the Scythian Empire at length. Anyway, so that they were there in Taxila. They're described. There are bits and pieces that we have from when the Greeks were there that tell us there were Zoroastrians there. So that would make logical thing when these people came in. The new religion comes in, teaching this completely radical belief system with, there's only one God, not 25 of them or 10 or many, only one God, capital G God, in heaven, and the other ones don't count. There are lots of little G gods crawling around. Nobody cared about them much. Just don't step on them. That's all. But anyway, there's capital G God in heaven. He created heaven and earth, and there's good stuff. If you're good, you'll go there. If you're bad, you go there. So be good, and so on and so on. These different ideas. Well, so that's Zoroastrian ideas, but it happens that those ideas, and this is not in my book, but while working on the Scythians, I read more about them and what Herodotus actually has more to say about them than almost anyone. But there are also other things. We have lots of information about the Scythians that people don't pay much attention to. That they had essentially this same ideas. So they had one capital G God in heaven, and who's responsible for creating everything. And the first Scythian, the Scythian royal lineage, that's descended from heavenly God meeting with a chthonic female deity, the daughter of the river god of the Borysthenes River, and that produced the ancestor of the Scythians, who had 3 sons, and the youngest son, who's the only one who succeeds at this one task, which shows that he must be have heavenly blood or ancestry. So he became the ancestor of the Scythians. The other ones, they become ancestors of other people. But anyhow, that myth, and there are several versions of it. So it tells us that story is there. And also they had some of the things that Zoroastrians do that are very unusual and striking as being characteristic features of Zoroastrianism. They have this bundle of sticks that they carry. It's called a barson, and they cast them out, and then they pick them back up again. I don't know what they do with them, but that's what the Scythians are described as doing. They don't have a word for it, but they have these special practitioners who do that, and other things. So it started sounding like, wait a minute, maybe the Buddha really was. I suggested this in Greek Buddha, but maybe the Buddha really was reacting against um, against Scythian Zoroastrians, you might say, or pre-Zoroastrians. And the same is true of Zoroaster. Apparently, he was reacting against people who had several gods or whatever. He said, only one, no, only Ahura Mazda. And he's the one who preaches this very explicitly, so we know. But his language, when I realized that the language of the Avestan language, it has two variants, Old Avestan and Young Avestan, but it's identical to Scythian. So if you do a linguistic study of and what we know about the Scythian language, and there is material, and you can't be distinguished. If you can't distinguish, you can't differentiate them, we could say, they're the same. So they're the same. It's the same language. So that means that Zoroaster spoke Scythian. And so the teachings of Zoroaster, the Zoroastrian, those are actually Scythian teachings. As Buddha was Shakyamuni, was the sage of the Scythians, as a no-brainer, he was reacting against the traditional teachings. And maybe he got it direct, from the Persian introduced Zoroastrians, who were partly also Scythians. There were lots of Scythian the garrisons.
Sure, and that's a connection there, right? So there were Scythian, as you say, garrisons that assisted the emperor Darius to invade that region. So Gandhara, I think you say.
Yes, that's right, Gandhara. Yeah, sorry to stop you there. I just wanted to finish my thought.
So what I'm picking up here, and this is the interesting part, is that essentially what you're saying is that Brahmanism is possibly younger than Buddhism, than well, at least what the Buddha said himself, not modern Buddhism, of course. And I just wanted to clarify this part because I think it's generally accepted, for example, that you have a text like the Rig Veda that was first, I guess it wasn't penned until relatively recently, but they suspect that the hymns in the Rig Veda, go back to 1500 or 1000 BC or whatever they say. I think there's quite a range there. But definitely back to the Bronze Age steppe, which I would imagine is where the Buddha's ancestors came from originally as well. That kind of, the Proto-Indo-Iranian cultures around there at the time. Is it right to say then that whatever those hymns were, is that separate to what you're describing here, or whatever religion was based around those hymns? How does that fit in? Do you have any idea?
Yes. Firstly, the Rig Veda, Rig Veda are not Brahmanists. They've been categorized together with Brahmanism because eventually, over time, after the Vedas, there were later Vedas. Then there were the Brahmanas, and there were this and that. All these different categories of these non-Buddhist, non-Jain, or whatever texts. This one particular system that develops. But if you look at the Rig Veda, there's not only no God, there's none of this stuff is there. None of it. There's no God, a God creating the world. There's no heaven and hell. No consequences for anything. And the sacrifices that people did with sacrificing blood sacrifices of animals were all for purposes to get something in this today, in this life, tomorrow, not any other time. And if you do something good or bad, whatever consequences you are from what you do, the good or the bad, you suffer the consequences or enjoy the consequences. And none of this is connected to that. So when you go just to look at the descriptions of Brahmanism, we don't have any description of Brahmanism before Megasthenes, actually. Megasthenes gives us a very good, fairly in-depth description of what the Brahmanas were doing back then. And he distinguishes them from the Buddhists, the Shramanas. It didn't mean any, just any ascetic person, by the way, Shramana. It only meant Buddhists until into the Middle Ages. It only meant Buddhists. There's some false scholarship out there making these claims. It's just not true. But the Brahmanists, who are distinguished sharply by, also by this King Priyadarshi, by the way, he distinguished the two different
That's
being the ancient.
Ashoka, popular.
And the Ashoka inscriptions doesn't have anything to do with this. It's all about Buddhism, normative Buddhism. It's just completely different. Anyway, yeah. But the Brahmanists, as described by Megasthenes, are one God in heaven. He created created the world, the universe, and he permeates it, and rules it and permeates it. And what was the other thing? And anyway, heaven and hell comes in there in the later stuff. But even the earliest Brahmanas and those other categories of texts, mostly in Sanskrit, by the way, those texts which have been pushed back way back, they're all post-Buddhist. This was shown not by me, but by Johannes Bronkhorst in his doctoral dissertation. And I have to say that I don't agree with much of his more recent work, lots of work on early history of Buddhism and Brahmanism and so on. Some things I think are quite right, but other things I think are not right. But I have to say that when it comes to this particular point, he does show exactly that the earliest, which Brahmana it is, but Brahmana, it has the earliest of these texts that are specifically Brahmanic. It has Buddhist characteristics and features in it, and you can't take them out. They're intrinsic. They were the things that apparently helped create Brahmanism. So Brahmanism didn't really exist right away. It seems like it was accepting. It accepted the Brahmanists, or some of the people in India, accepted Zoroastrianism. The Buddha and others, no doubt, rejected Zoroastrianism, or the Scythian version of Zoroastrianism, which we can call Zoroastrian A or something, whatever. But anyway, that system. So the Brahmanists accepted most of it. The God in heaven, heaven and earth, all these good and bad, that stuff is in there. And whereas the Buddha didn't accept it, but the Buddhism, as it went along, developed certain specific characteristic features which have to do with practice, with all kinds of things, and the Brahmanas picked up some of that. So that's in there. So you have wait a minute, what is this doing there? It's not what you would expect. So it can't have been around. I mean, as I said, Bronkhorst is the one who has shown this, and
it's quite an incredible notion, because that kind of flips everything on its head that people think they know about, the structure of religions at that time. And I was just thinking now, I just had the thought that you have the Agni ritual in Hinduism today, and obviously the Zoroastrians were fire worshippers, or still are. Could be another connection there, I guess.
Yeah, very likely. But I think that late Zoroastrianism, yes, they have this thing with fire and fire ceremonies and so on. But early Zoroastrianism, I don't think they have any mention of it. I'm not sure in the it might be. I just don't recall any in my reading of the old Avesta. But anyway, the Scythians don't talk about it.
It always struck me, and what's really interesting about what you're saying, and when I first read your book, what really struck me is that you have many Hindus today, for example, that kind of paint the Buddha as like just another Hindu sage, which always struck me as being wildly anachronistic, to be honest, given what we know about people in the area at that time. And what you're saying now really is quite extraordinary, and nailing that home. That's not something many people would have an easy time accepting. I would imagine, particularly Hindu people. Have you had much interaction with Hindu people that have heard this?
Not Hindu people, but with people interested in Buddhism from India and Nepal. I had some interactions with them, and they're more interested in trying to have Buddha be a local, from Nepal. I should mention in connection with the Brahmanism, Hindu is wanting it to be, Buddha is just another good old ancient Hindu. The Jains said the same thing. Buddha was a Jain, he studied with Mahavira or something, but there's just no evidence. This is one of the things that actually has been discussed by scholars back and forth. And of course, nobody can agree on anything, but there just isn't any archaeological evidence for the existence of Jainism until after the Greeks were there anyway. Yeah, so no way that's he never did any of that stuff. And the traditional stories have the Buddha, and Mahavira, and who are the others? The founders of various other ancient sects. They all knew each other, and one of the other of these, there's several of these stories, but such and such a king wanted to know what to do about this, and he asked, well, you should ask the sages out there. So he went to this one, went to this one, and if only finding when he got to the Buddha, he got the right answer, something like that. So he talked to all different guys, including Mahavira and so on. So they all knew each other. They went bowling together. They were good guys, and they just didn't agree on a lot of stuff, but they were cool. They knew each other. It's all ahistorical fairy tales. By the way, I love fairy tales, so don't get me wrong on that. I'm just saying that the stories that are masquerading as history about early Indian thought, they're from the late antiquity, the Middle Ages, and they're just absolutely, they're fantastic stories. You've read some of those stories, I'm sure.
Sure. And I suppose we should make the statement that, the history of something and the religious tradition themselves are probably a little bit different. They're living things, aren't they, traditions? So you have to make that demarcation a little bit, not get too emotional about it all, even though some people no doubt will. So one thing I wanted to talk about in terms of texts and the veracity of texts is specifically with Buddhism, and you go to lengths to talk about the chronology of the Pali canon, and which texts come later and which texts, how long was it written after the Buddha existed, blah blah blah. And what was interesting is I think you looked into the Chinese canon. Is that correct? Yeah. Could you go, are there any differences? I mean, is there anything there that you feel is more relevant than in the Pali, or and in terms of the Buddhist doctrine itself, how is that different? Do you know what I'm saying? So when was it written? How different is it, do you think, from the original Buddhism? And yeah, if we could just have a little bit of a discussion about, which bits of the canon are perhaps more relevant than others, or in terms of their historicity.
I would like to be able to do this too, but it's actually a huge topic, and I'm not at all a specialist in it. All I can say is that when the Chinese first started translating Buddhist texts into Chinese, it was already the 2nd century CE. We don't have any translations, verifiable translations from before that. It seems not. The stories are not. They're just stories. So, but when we actually have the text, then the thing is that they were presented at court, and so they have an official date, such and such a year, such and such an emperor. We know who that was and when that was, so we have dates on things. But in India, we don't have dates on anything, and none of that stuff is dated. It's been shown by scholars who I couldn't name right at the moment, but that it was only a very short time that after a text appeared in India, evidently, it was translated into Chinese. This was not immediately the earliest period, but not long after that, they started getting texts on a regular basis. The newest texts, now how they got them is some of them are written and some of them are oral. But anyway, they came to China and were translated into Chinese. So then it makes you think, okay, well, what about before that? Yeah, what about before that? When did they start having texts like this? Well, if they were in Sanskrit, excuse me, but we don't have any evidence for that Sanskrit even existed, despite what people say. Any hard evidence, I should say. No hard evidence, no manuscripts, no inscriptions, no nothing. The earliest inscription that's been said to be pre-CE goes back a decade or two before the turn of the millennium back then. It's a crappy little, excuse me, not a very beautiful little stone with an inscription on it, which is in very poor Sanskrit. It's not a good example of Sanskrit at all, but that's the first thing. Before that, there's nothing. We have nothing in Sanskrit. Anything that was written was done in Prakrit. Pali is one of the Prakrits, and Gandhari is another Prakrit, and so on. There are various Prakrits, and these are Middle Indic languages, but they were actually attested way earlier than Sanskrit. So if there's anything in Prakrit that exists, the earliest texts that were translated into Chinese are said to have been translated from Gandhari, which makes perfect sense. The Pali canon in Sri Lanka is in Pali, which is a Prakrit. The dates for all these things are almost always, it's just sort of a rule for Oriental history, is that if they say something happened at such and such a time in antiquity, way back, it's always a higher date, virtually always a higher date. It just wasn't that old, it's not that old. So you have to suspect all those dates, and we don't have any hard evidence for them at all, none. So without hard evidence, when they found a cache of Gandhari manuscripts were found recently in northwest Pakistan, northeastern Afghanistan, in some abandoned monastery. They found these texts, and they've been studied by people in several different research institutes, mainly in Europe and the United States. And they've been translating these things, and they're very important, some of them quite early, but mainly they're not earlier than the 2nd century CE. And there's only a few that might be earlier than that. The dates, people give different dates.
So really that's 700 years after the Buddha was meant to have lived.
Possibly, yeah. If the Buddha lived, let's just say that he lived just around the time when Darius introduced, or just after the time Darius introduced Zoroastrianism. That was my original reason, one of the reasons for discussing it in Greek Buddha. And if you lived a little bit at that time, or a little bit after that, when Zoroastrian presence there would be strongly felt, because it was still, vibrant, and there were people still teaching it and practicing it, and not having become localized or nativized. Then it would have made a big impact on people with these new ideas. So that would be a good reason to react against it. And that was my justification for that. If we take that away and say it was just Scythians, well, actually the Scythians came in with Darius. It's still the same. It's not any different. It's just that they brought in the same teachings, So the Scythians and the Zoroastrians in the Persian Empire would have followed essentially the same, roughly the same belief system. Maybe if they belonged to an old believer type system, maybe they had different. It was a little bit different. I don't know, but anyhow, that still puts the likely period of that impact. And if Buddha himself is, since he, as a philosopher, he was probably not a farmer or something. He was from the upper class. And as the tradition has, he was a prince. It actually makes perfect sense. He probably was something like that.
So I guess you have what you traditionally see is the Brahmin class structure. So you have the priesthood and the Kshatriya, blah blah blah.
I don't know about that. I don't know about that. I know about that too.
Yeah. Did the Scythians have a class structure? Do you think
They didn't have anything like. They had a feudal system, like medieval feudal system, strict medieval European feudal system. Comes from Central Eurasia. It was reintroduced by the Huns and the Goths. They reintroduced it into Western Europe. It had disappeared under Roman, in the impact of the Romans, who were very Mediterranean and not feudal. But it's a hierarchical feudal system, God at the top, and the king, the great king, and then below him, the dukes and the other sub-kings, or whatever you want to call them. That system, but also with the religious beliefs, were similar to that. So I think that's we have to assume that's what the Scythian system was. What we know about the Scythian system, that's the way it was.
Just to go into this, and I will finish up soon because I'm mindful I've taken a lot of your time. So my understanding of Scythians, and when you first started mentioning this, it was fascinating to me because, like, they're a kind of a little bit of a mysterious culture, and obviously they weren't literate, so they didn't write anything down, as far as I know. And I think most people's idea, and my idea anyways, is they're very much a steppe culture, drinking, uncut wine out of skulls and imbibing cannabis and teepees and, this kind of stuff. And then, of course, you have the magnificent goldsmithing and artwork from the mound burials, which are spectacular. And they did a good job, obviously, of bullying the sedentary cultures around the place, which, they're well known for. Or is that a false narrative? Is it?
Yes, it's the opposite.
Okay, they tried to bully them.
Yeah. Darius invaded them.
Yeah.
They defeated
unsuccessfully.
they defeated them by running away. That was the classic the guerrilla warfare. They really couldn't fight against this enormous army containing about 1 million men, including all the support staff.
So my idea of them is that they're a pantheistic culture. So as you were saying, many gods and goddesses and stuff. And just quickly, I wanted to clarify, like, so if they brought with them Zoroastrianism, or was it enforced on them by the emperor as a condition of their service or something like that? How did they come to embrace Zoroastrianism?
Well, I didn't make it clear. No, it's the other way around. So the Persians, Darius as being the first one that we know was actually a Persian and who was teaching these teachings. But it actually, before him, the Medes followed the same teachings very clearly. And the Medes had their Medes were actually Scytho-Medes. They were part of northwestern Iran, northeastern Turkey was part of the Scythian Empire at its greatest extent. And these people all became Scythianized and learned to speak Scythian. The Median language is, again, like Avestan. It's identical to Scythian, to what we have of it. So it's the same language. So it's not like Persian is very different. So whatever their ideas were, they went along with them. So those people, the Scytho-Medes, and to some extent the Persians, they got these ideas about what we call Zoroastrian ideas. Now, it looks like they already had actual Zoroastrianism. That means the reformed teachings of Zoroaster. But Zoroaster's teachings are a reform, as he himself says. Essentially, it tells us this if you read the old Avesta, that the old teachings had the old system had several different gods or contenders for being God. But if you look at what we hear about the divinity among the Scythians from the Greeks and from the Chinese, as a matter of fact, on the East, because they also had Scythians there. They had a system where it was a feudal system, like in heaven, as on earth, with a supreme god, the capital G god, I call them. That was God at the top. So it's a kind of like monotheism. People like to say, "Oh, it's henotheism because there were other gods." No, the other ones were not in the same category. They didn't belong to the same category. You have to categorize everything, and I talk a lot about categorization in the Greek Buddha, but I actually have a book on it called, it's in my bibliography called, what did I call it anyway? But I don't call it categorization. Anyway, they had this hierarchical system, and the people further down the hierarchy, there were no slaves in the Scythian realm. In the Central Eurasia as a whole, they didn't practice slavery. But the people at the bottom, or of the hierarchy, they didn't have anybody below them that they could order around. So, if you go down from your dukes, down to your earls and down to your counts, and then, down to your knights or whatever you got at the bottom, if there's nobody below you, you're at the bottom, well, then you're not really that well off. But they weren't slaves. I think that's a key thing, and people argue about this.
Sure. They seem to be referred to as quite a noble culture, like by Herodotus and other people like that, at least as far as I'm aware, for that reason.
Yes. The I think the Scythians have got a bad rap, but all Central Eurasian peoples have gotten a bad rap. And that is because the people writing the histories are all the enemies. And they were actually mostly enemies because, not always, but generally speaking, they were trying to invade Central Eurasia and take over the land because there was land out there to be taken. And so the Chinese were trying to do that, the Persians were trying to do that, the Romans were doing that, just about everybody was doing that. And then when a new people would become strong in the steppe and kick them out, they expanded throughout the entire steppe zone. This happened like 4 or 5 times from the Scythians up to through the Turks and the Mongols. The Mongols were pretty much the last one that really succeeded in doing this. And this enormous thing, they united the entire thing, and they went over a little bit into the borderland areas, which were part steppe and part agricultural. And so, and those are the regions where their ideas were transmitted directly to the people who were living there by creolization. They mixed with those people, they married them, and their children, spoke. Sometimes they spoke the introduced language, or they spoke the other language with some loan words, but they got a lot of the culture that way, and they passed on those ideas. So it's mainly I've studied in great detail in some aspects of the Central Eurasian history with the neighboring empires, and it's virtually always, and the Romans and the Chinese actually tell you this if you read it carefully. They say, well, actually, it was the Chinese who were the ones who were invading the Central Eurasia, or the Romans' fault. Where the Huns did this, they were just defending themselves, and the Huns mostly, by the way, were just allies of the Romans. So it's just the usual popular history of these things is completely wrong, and scholars are responsible for that. We haven't straightened it out.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent way to finish, because I think this Chris is going to be a nuclear bomb to a lot of people who are going to listen to it. But I love it. I love it. It's great.
Well, I know you wanted to talk more about other things, but I guess we didn't get to them. So
that's okay. Maybe next time. I think I'm really looking forward to your book coming out, and maybe we can catch up again afterwards, because I'd love to go through it. The history of the steppe is endlessly fascinating to me. So I'd love to talk about it again. I just had a couple of questions, if you don't mind, from the listeners. Mr. Beckwith has some idea on this, or Dr. Beckwith, I should say. What are Greek contributions to Buddhism via the Indo-Greek element that survive today?
Mm-hmm. Yes, a good question. And the problem with this, again, is it's a partly historiographical problem to determine what we don't have really good evidence. Nobody wrote anything down about this when it was going on. Not a lot of accounts of the Indo-Greeks in any language. But one of the things that happened, and that's in my, I think, I actually have an article about the invention of the monastery and monasticism. I would call it an invention. It was developed suddenly, so that pretty much counts as an invention, doesn't it? Under the Kushans, the Kushan Empire, and the Kushans were a late Scythian-speaking people who moved into the area of what is now southern Uzbekistan and northern Afghanistan, ancient Bactriana, and became eventually founded an empire, and in that they seem to have sponsored all sorts of different religions. So people can't say that they were really just pro-Buddhist. But one of the things that Buddhists did when they spread, and this is the normative Buddhism I'm talking about, that means standard Buddhism like we know with monks and the Vinaya and all the sutras and all that sort of thing. When this develops, one of the things they do when they move to a new culture, a new country, or with a new culture, new language, they always have to make their way somehow, and they do it by going to the top. Every time they go to the king or the dukes or whatever, the rich people, the wealthy people, the powerful people, to get them to support them. And this is partly because Buddhism, monks weren't supposed to work, and they needed to have support to have a monastery, a vihara. They weren't called viharas in the beginning, by the way. They were called deras. It's a different word. But anyway, so this for some reason the Kushans thought, okay, this is a great idea. They will do my work, and spread Buddhism all around this area, far beyond his armies could go. And they did all the way practically to China itself, just to the borders of China, all the way across Central Asia. And to the west too, and south and east into India. And in some places, the Kushan Empire, spread in that area as well. But if you look at from the early viharas, these monasteries from the outside, they look like fortresses. They cannot be distinguished from fortresses. The monks, they're regimented. Everybody got their head shaved. They wore a standard robe, ideally something cast off, but it probably wasn't. It was just they gave them something, They wore the standard robe, and everybody did everything. They lived in a standard cell-like thing, like a barracks. That's what it was, and that's where they every time they moved into a new area, they built more of these. And there's a project. I forgot the name of this project, but I have an article about this, which I will send to you if you like. Just send me a reminder about the viharas in the Kushan Empire. And it talks exactly about how this happened. And I think this was, I don't talk about the plan itself, how it developed, but it's been thought for a long time, suspected that it had something to do with a Greek, a typical Greek plan. It doesn't look like a typical Indian type plan or a Central Asian plan at all. The architectural plan, looking at it, vertically, looking down at the outlines of the thing. It's very distinctive once you see it, and they're all the ones built by the Kushans. They all follow this exactly the same plan. It was like a blueprint, all the way as far as Magadha in the east and north, well into Central Asia, all the way to China. You can tell them right away when you find a vihara. That's what it is. It has this distinctive plan. So I think that maybe a Greek contribution, and something about the argumentation that they did in the monasteries. The Greeks were really addicted to disputation.
And these were the colleges you're referring to earlier.
There was no distinction between a monastery and a college. It was this one thing. It eventually kind of diverged in the West, but anyhow, I think this is, and I had this book, The Warriors of the Cloisters. It's about what they were doing, what they were arguing about, and how they argued, and about the monasteries and the colleges and how they spread through Islam into Western Europe. And it comes from that area, Gandhara. It seems to be the home of it.
Well, I'm getting reminders of when I was in Tibet, and I was in I forget which monastery it was. It was anyway. It was one of the ones in Lhasa, one of the big ones. And if you look at those monasteries, and I guess it's to do with the geography as well, but they look kind of fort-like. And this particular group of monks did debating during the day, and I'm getting reminded of that actually. With you talking about that, and in one of your other books on the steppe, I forget what it was, but it was
Fires of the Silk Road.
That's the one, yeah. So just quickly, there's a connection between these colleges then and Islam, because a lot of people in the Islamic tradition went to study there, or am I misplacing the narrative?
It's given in my book, Warriors of the Cloisters. Unfortunately, the way it was typeset in that particular spot is easy for people to miss if they're not reading carefully, which people do. You need to, every word is important. But anyway, what happened when Islam came in, the Arabs came in, right? That was part of this big imperial conquest. That's nothing to do specifically really with Islam, but Islam went along with it because it was one of the things that motivated them to join together. One of the things that united the Arabs in the beginning. And so they went in all the way into Central Asia and so on, and all these areas, the area of Bactria, what is northern Afghanistan, southern Uzbekistan, and beyond. Those areas were heavily Buddhist. Well, despite what people would think, they didn't go in and just destroy everything and kill everybody. people were valuable and they didn't want to kill everybody. They wanted people to become Muslims, so they encouraged them by giving them a tax break if you converted. That's basically what the thing was.
That'd work.
Yeah,
No wonder it
but
spread
eventually,
so quickly. Yeah.
well, Islam developed a high civilization, with all these people from these cities that they're, especially in Central Asia. That was the center of it all. And so a lot of Buddhism came in somehow. We don't know exactly the details of it, but so far as the college is concerned, the monastery, the college, monastery, college, they were all over Central Asia, including especially Bactriana. And those were converted. When they converted, the people converted to Islam. Well, so let's just say I'm sitting here, you're sitting there, and we decide to convert to Islam or some other religion. And so, well, my house right now is not a religious house, but then it will become an Islamic house. Or the college is not a college, a Christian college or something like that. There weren't any yet, but were Buddhist ones, and they became Islamic ones. And everything exactly the same with the same. The architectural plan is identical, and not only the architectural plan, but also the waqf in Arabic. What is it called? The foundation, the donative foundation, or whatever you call it, for that institution. They follow the same rules. So the Buddhists became Muslims, and they still stayed there. They were still there. The best one we know is the Nobahar in Balkh, Noah Vihara, the new Vihara. It was a great one, one of the biggest ones that Xuanzang stayed there on his journey to India. And studied with somebody there, got one of these huge texts, which he translated, which we have because he got it and brought it back. He lugged it back. It's the biggest text in the Buddhist canon. But they were doing that stuff. So shortly after that, the Arabs came in. They were still using this, though. The Nobahar remained basically a Buddhist institution, evidently, for another 100 years at least. And there are many aspects of early Islamic civilization which are due to them.
Yeah, it's interesting because from a religious point of view, and I was talking to a traditionalist scholar that had compared Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and Buddhism, and a few other things. But there's striking similarities in Islamic doctrine to Buddhism, and it seems in many ways to be closer to Buddhism than it does to like a Trinitarian religion like Christianity or Judaism, for example. It's the conception of the absolute and all these kinds of things you could see as easily deriving from that interaction. Yeah. So just one more, I guess. Because I know this person was particularly interested in your take on Lao Tzu. I hope I'm saying that correctly.
Lao Tzu?
Zhe. I lived in China for a while. I always thought the Z was a Zhe, but I could be wrong.
No. Because it's a DZ. DZ.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, whatever it is, I can't make the sound. So, so his question is, I understand there are some striking similarities between Daoism and Buddhism. How accurate is it to say that old Daoism may be closer to the original Buddhism than modern Buddhism? So is Daoism because, as you say in your books, and we didn't talk about this today, but that the historical Buddha may well be Lao Tzu.
Yes, it seems to be the name. His name Lao Tzu is just it's a traditional short version. All the ancient Chinese philosophers have names like that, but Lao Tzu doesn't follow the pattern because of the Lao part, and he has another name. His full name is said to be Lao Dan. Well, Lao, that character in ancient Chinese, they say, well, this is another character. It's the same as a character. Those are now modern pronunciations, by the way. So this is more than 2,000 years ago. The Chinese language underwent vast changes in that period of time. This is twice, at least, major changes. So unrecognizable almost from what it was before. But anyway, one of the other alternate one was Cao. Well, Cao would come regularly from Gao. if you are following the usual rules for reconstruction. So, and then Lao Dan, the Dan part in modern Mandarin pronunciation, that's modern Mandarin pronunciation of both, that was pronounced Dam. So then it's Gaudam. And there was a final ah after that M, a short one. So it's Gautama. And there's even, it's a, well, yeah, they got it from the Gandhari, so it would be a Gandhari form. Well, the other reading for those characters is Gudama, which is exactly Gandhari. So one way or the other, you can't avoid it. It's just clearly that is the name of Gautama. Did they actually have the Buddha there? No. It's just that the teachings, somebody was there teaching those teachings, and they called him probably Gautama or something like that, because he kept saying, as the Master Gautama says, the Master Gautama says, the Master Gautama says, that's how they're teaching the ideas. And so some of his ideas made their way to China. They're very clear. The very beginning of the Tao Te Ching is just, all things are, the dharmas are impermanent. That Dao Ka Dao, Fei Chang Dao. All the dharmas that can be expressed or something like that are impermanent. Literally, people don't translate it that way, but not eternal. Eternal means impermanent. So.
It's fascinating to think that like you could have an initial influence from the oldest Buddhism, or pretty old Buddhism, that turned into Daoism, and then later on, in the 800s, someone else comes from India and introduces Buddhism, and then you have this amalgamation in China of these two almost streams of Buddhism that have just changed over time, and then they've led to the creation of something else. It's quite something to think about.
What did you say happened in the 800s? I didn't quite catch that.
So I think that's when the first patriarch of Zen, or Chan, as they know, and it was first meant to have been in China, or made his way to China. I think his name's Bodhidharma, and it may not have been the 800s. It could have. That's just what I thought, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, that would be Buddhism in China. Organized Buddhism, including Bodhidharma, is all CE or AD times. It's not BC. Okay, so but not as late as the 800s. Earlier than that. But Bodhidharma in Japan, that's around the time when Bodhidharma's teachings made their way to Japan, or whoever he really was. But the Buddha himself, the Lao Tzu, that represents somebody who had teachings of the Buddha, and that can be dated at no later than about 300 BC, because of the earliest manuscript of the book Tao Te Ching, the book of Lao Tzu, is found in a Chinese burial, and which has been dated on other grounds. So it had to have been written and copied over long before that. But anyway, no later than that burial was closed, which is just after 300 BC.
Well, that would be the earliest textual reference then, wouldn't it?
That is one of the earliest textual, let's see, that would be almost exactly the time of Megasthenes, and 20 years after Pyrrho. All this happening is about the same time. There's a reason for it. So I talk about that a little bit in my book, Scythian Empire, and why things happen when they happen. But that's about all I can say about it right now. As you said, we're gone a little bit.
We have, but it's been an amazing chat, Chris. Thank you. So just quickly, could you tell us a little bit when your book's coming out, and just plug your projects that are coming up?
Sure. I have two new books coming out. One is the Scythian Empire, and the subtitle is Central Eurasia and the Birth of the Classical Age from Persia to China. Long subtitle, but my tradition, I guess. And that's coming out from Princeton, and it's supposed to be in the fall of this year. It's about the Scythians and their empire. It wasn't an empire; it didn't last for very long, like all the other steppe empires, but it spread all over the place, and they spread Scythian and their Scythians' ideas, and they had a strong influence even after they didn't have a great empire. They had local influence in all those regions, especially northern China and what is now in northern Iran, approximately, but in Central Asia. But anyway, it talks about them, and it talks about all the different things that they influenced, including clothes. They were the style masters of the age. Everybody talks about the wonderful clothes, and they usually credit them to the Medes. But when you look at the paintings, you see, oh wow, the Greek vases have lots of paintings of Scythian warriors.
Yeah, I've seen several renditions of, I think it was Kurgan burials of some of the ceremonial gear that they're buried with, and yeah, they got some impressive swag. I think is the new way to describe it. That's for sure. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming on. This has been absolutely fascinating. I could probably go for another 2 hours, to be honest. I had so much material, but I guess we can maybe look at covering that next time. Just for the listeners, I'm going to post your book links, I guess, to Amazon, and I'll keep everyone informed of the publication of this new book coming up. But thank you for your time again, and this has been a wonderful chat, and I got a lot from it.
Thank you very much. Also, take care.
Please subscribe for more content and videos like this. We discuss philosophy, practical spirituality, and ecology, and much more. And your engagement is always appreciated.